The siren tore through the camp before dawn, and I was awake before my eyes even opened. Every child in that place learned to wake like that, fast and silent, because a slow child was a child who got left behind. I grabbed the only thing that mattered to me, a small wooden bird carved by my father, and pressed it into my palm so hard the beak left a mark on my skin. Around me, tents shook as families scrambled into the mud. Guards with tall silver rifles walked the fence line, their eyes glowing faintly under the helmets, watching us the way a farmer watches nervous cattle. I was 7 years old, and I had already learned that the world outside our fence did not care whether I lived or died. My name is Ellen, and this camp was not a place with a name, only a number stamped on a metal sign at the gate. We were the leftovers of a broken planet, gathered up like scraps after Earth fell to an empire called the Voktar. I did not remember the fall itself. I was too young. What I remembered was heat, dust, the smell of recycled water, and the constant hum of ships passing overhead, so massive they blotted out the sun for entire minutes at a time. That morning, the siren was not for an attack. It was for a visit. Word spread through the camp faster than any siren could carry it. A member of the royal family was coming, some young noble on a tour of the outer worlds, and the guards wanted the camp to look calm, orderly, harmless. They pushed us into rows. They handed out clean shirts nobody had seen in months. An old woman named Margaret, who looked after a dozen of us orphan children as if we were her own, knelt in front of me and tucked my shirt into my trousers with shaking hands. "Stand still," she whispered. "Say nothing unless spoken to. Look at the ground." I nodded, though I did not understand why any of it mattered. To me, one alien in fine armor looked much the same as another. They all carried the same coldness in their eyes, the same distance, as though we were insects they had not yet decided whether to step on. The convoy arrived an hour later. 3 long black vehicles floated over the mud without touching it, engines humming a low note that made my teeth ache. Guards fanned out first, then advisors in dark robes, and finally, stepping out last, a young Voktar woman in pale armor the color of morning frost. She did not look like the others. The Voktar guards moved like machines, faces blank, eyes forward. She moved like someone curious, her head turning slightly at every sound, every face, every ragged tent. Her skin held a faint silver sheen, and her eyes were a deep violet that seemed to catch the weak sunlight and hold it. She could not have been much older than a teenager by her people's measure, though I had no way of knowing that then. All I knew was that she looked at us, actually looked, the way you look at something you are trying to understand, not something you are trying to ignore. The advisors walked her down the first row of children, reciting facts about food rations and shelter numbers in flat, practiced voices. She barely seemed to hear them. Her violet eyes kept drifting past the adults, past the guards, down toward us, the smallest ones standing in the dirt. When she reached my row, she stopped. I do not know why she stopped at me specifically. Perhaps it was the way I stood, too stubborn to look at the ground the way Margaret had told me to. Perhaps it was simple chance. She crouched down slowly, her armor clicking softly with the movement, until her eyes were level with mine. "What is your name?" she asked, in halting words that sounded like they had been learned from a lesson book rather than spoken naturally. The advisors behind her stiffened. One of them opened his mouth to object, but she raised a single finger without even looking back, and he fell silent instantly. That small gesture told me more about her position than any of the robes or armor. Whoever she was, people listened when she moved her hand. "Ellen," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. She repeated my name carefully, testing the sound of it, and something in her expression softened. "Ellen," she said again, as though she liked the shape of it in her mouth. I do not remember deciding to do what I did next. I only remember that my hand was already moving, pulling the wooden bird from my pocket and holding it out toward her. It was the only thing of value I owned in the entire universe. My father had carved it for me the winter before he died, whittling it slowly by lamplight from a scrap of fence post, telling me it was a bird that could fly farther than any ship, because it flew inside a person's heart instead of the sky. I did not think about what I was doing. I only knew that this stranger had looked at me and seen a person instead of a number, and something in me wanted to give her the only good thing I had. "For you," I said. The silence that followed felt enormous. Margaret's hand tightened on my shoulder from behind, and I heard one of the advisors mutter something sharp under his breath, a warning perhaps, or an insult, I could not tell. The young noblewoman did not move for a long moment. She stared at the small carved bird resting in my open palm, her violet eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. "You have nothing," she said quietly, almost to herself, "and still you give." I did not fully understand what she meant by that, not then. I only shrugged, the way children shrug when adults say something too big for them to hold. "It's a good bird," I said. "It doesn't get scared of the ships." Something flickered across her face, an expression I would spend years trying to name. It might have been sorrow, it might have been shame, it might have simply been surprise, the kind that comes from meeting something the world had never taught her to expect. She did not take the bird from my hand. Instead, she reached into a small pouch at her belt and drew out a pendant, a smooth piece of crystal, the color of deep water, hanging from a fine silver chain. It looked delicate, almost too delicate for the armored glove that held it. She pressed it gently into my palm, closing my fingers around it with both of her hands. "Keep your bird," she said, "and keep this too, a gift for a gift." I stared down at the crystal, confused, unsure what I was supposed to do with something so clearly valuable. When I looked back up to ask her, the advisors were already stepping forward, murmuring about schedules and time, urging her back toward the black vehicles. She rose to her feet slowly, her eyes still on mine. "Remember this, small one," she said, struggling a little with the human words. "Humans give when they have nothing. I will not forget it." Then she was gone, swallowed by robes and guards and the low hum of engines, and within minutes the convoy lifted off the mud and shrank into the pale morning sky until it disappeared entirely. The camp exhaled around me, tension breaking into confused whispers. Margaret pulled me close, checking my hands, my face, as though the visit might have left some invisible mark on me. Other children crowded around, eyes wide, asking what the crystal was, whether it was worth anything, whether the noblewoman would come back. I did not answer them. I closed my fist around the pendant and felt its cool surface press against my skin, and for reasons I could not explain, I felt less afraid than I had in a very long time. That night, lying on my thin mat inside our crowded tent, I turned the pendant over and over between my fingers, watching the way it caught the weak lamplight and scattered it into tiny blue sparks across the canvas ceiling. Margaret sat beside me, mending a torn sleeve by feel rather than sight, and she watched me with tired, careful eyes. "You should not have done that," she said softly, "giving away your father's bird like that, to one of them." "I didn't give it away," I said. "I still have it." "You offered it. That is enough to have angered someone with less patience than her." Margaret shook her head slowly, though there was something like wonder buried underneath her worry. "In all my years in this camp, I have never seen one of the royal family stop walking. Not once. They pass through like weather. They do not stop." "She stopped," I said, holding the pendant up so it caught the lamplight again. She looked at me like I was real. Margaret did not answer that. She only reached over and closed my fingers gently around the crystal, the same way the noblewoman had done hours before, and told me to sleep. I did not know it then, curled up on that thin mat with a stranger's gift pressed against my chest, but that single quiet meeting in the mud of a nameless camp would follow me across every year that came after. I would grow up fighting a war I did not choose, losing people I loved, hardening into someone Margaret might not have recognized. But somewhere underneath all of it, I would carry the memory of a girl with violet eyes who knelt down in the dirt to look me in the face, who took nothing from a child who had nothing, and who told me, in broken words she barely understood herself, that kindness was worth remembering. I did not know her name that night. I would not learn it for many years, but I would never forget her eyes, or the weight of the pendant in my hand, or the strange, impossible feeling that somewhere in that vast, indifferent empire, one person had actually seen me. I held on to that feeling because, in the months that followed, the world gave me very few reasons to hold on to anything else. The camp guards grew stricter after the royal visit, as though embarrassed by whatever softness had been shown that day. Rations shrank instead of growing. Margaret grew thinner, giving away pieces of her own meals to the youngest of us without ever admitting she was doing it. I learned to go hungry without complaint, to move quietly, to disappear into corners when the guards walked past. I learned, most of all, to survive. But every night, before I slept, I would take out the pendant and the wooden bird together, holding one in each hand, and remind myself that somewhere far above the fences and the mud and the hum of passing ships, a stranger with violet eyes had once knelt down in front of a starving child and treated her like she mattered. I did not know then how much that single memory would come to cost me, or how much it would one day be worth. 11 years later, I was crouched behind a burned-out transport, waiting for a signal, when Daniel's voice crackled through my earpiece and told me the plan had changed. "They moved the shipment," he said, breathless, running somewhere I could not see. "Guards doubled. Owen wants us to fall back." I did not fall back. I never fell back. Not once in 3 years of fighting, and Daniel knew it, even as he said the words. I peered around the edge of the wreckage and watched a line of Vokhtar supply crates being loaded onto a hovering platform under heavy guard. Medicine crates meant for a garrison, meant to keep our enemies alive and comfortable while human settlements 2 valleys over were dying of a sickness those same medicines could cure. "I'm not falling back," I said. "Cover the east side. I'm going in." "Ellen, that's 6 guards on that platform alone." "Then you'd better be a good shot," I said, and moved before he could argue further. The years between the camp and that night had not been gentle to me. I had grown into someone Margaret would barely recognize, lean and fast and quiet, in ways that had nothing to do with childhood anymore. After the sickness took her, 3 winters after the royal visit, I had drifted from camp to camp until the resistance found me, or perhaps I found them, crawling out of the wreckage of a raided settlement with nothing left to lose. Owen Hale, the man who led our cell, used to say that the war did not create fighters, it only revealed the ones who had been fighters all along, waiting for a reason. I had plenty of reasons. I had lost Margaret to a disease we were denied the medicine to cure. I had lost my birth settlement to a punishment raid after someone, somewhere, dared to resist. I had lost count of the faces I used to know, replaced now by a small, tight circle of people who trusted each other because trusting anyone else had become a luxury none of us could afford. Daniel was one of those people, a lanky young man with a crooked smile who had once been a teacher before the war turned him into something else entirely. He argued with me constantly and followed me anyway, which I had come to understand was simply how he showed loyalty. Owen was another, older, quieter, carrying the kind of tired authority that came from having buried more friends than he could count. And there was Grace, small and sharp-eyed, who could talk her way past a checkpoint with nothing but a smile and a lie, and who had saved my life more times than I liked to admit. That night, it was just Daniel and me against a heavily guarded shipment, which was exactly the sort of odds Owen hated and I had stopped caring about. I moved low along the tree line, my rifle steady, my breathing controlled the way years of fighting had trained it to be. The Vokhtar guards on the platform were relaxed, careless in the way soldiers get when they believe the war has already been won. That carelessness was the only advantage humanity had left, and we used it whenever we could. I do not enjoy remembering the fight that followed. It was fast, brutal, and over before I had time to feel much of anything beyond the roaring focus that carried me through it. When it ended, the platform was ours, 6 guards down, the medicine crates intact, and waiting to be carried to the valley where they were desperately needed. Daniel found me afterward, breathing hard, his hands shaking slightly the way they always did after a fight, no matter how many times he told himself he was used to it by then. "You're going to get yourself killed one of these days," he said, not for the first time. "Not today," I said, and helped him load the crates. We carried that medicine 2 valleys over ourselves, on foot, through the night, because we did not trust any transport that could be tracked. By the time we reached the settlement, dawn was breaking, and a woman named Laura, who ran what passed for a clinic in that broken little town, wept openly when she saw what we had brought her. I remember standing in her doorway, exhausted, filthy, and feeling for the first time in months something close to purpose. That was the shape of my life in those years. Fight, survive, carry what little good we could manage from one desperate place to another, and try not to think too hard about how many of us were dying to make it possible. I still carried the pendant, hidden always beneath my clothes, close enough to feel its weight against my skin during every fight, every retreat, every quiet moment of grief. I had never told anyone in the resistance where it came from, not even Daniel, who I trusted with almost everything else. It felt like a secret too strange to share, a soft, impossible memory in a life that had become almost entirely hard edges. Sometimes, late at night, when the others were asleep and I could not stop my mind from turning over the day's losses, I would take the pendant out and hold it, and the wooden bird beside it, and let myself remember violet eyes kneeling in the mud, a voice stumbling over unfamiliar words, a promise that felt too small to matter and yet had somehow followed me across an entire war. I did not understand, in those years, why I kept it. Logic told me it was foolish, even dangerous, to carry a token from the Empire that had destroyed everything I once knew. If the resistance had found it on me without knowing its history, they might have suspected me of collaboration, might have looked at me the way I had learned to look at strangers, with suspicion sharpened by years of betrayal. But I could not bring myself to throw it away, no matter how many times I told myself I should. Owen noticed it once, months after the medicine run, during a quiet evening when our cell had gathered in the ruins of an old farmhouse to plan our next move. I had grown careless, letting the chain slip loose from my collar while cleaning a wound on my arm, and he caught sight of the crystal glinting in the firelight. "That's Vokhtar craftsmanship," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of a man who had survived this long by missing nothing. "Where did you get that?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain something I barely understood myself. "A long time ago," I said finally. "Before all this, someone gave it to me. One of them gave it to you. She was young," I said, "younger than most of the ones we fight now. She knelt down and talked to me like I was a person, instead of vermin. It was the only kindness I remember from before the war got bad." Owen studied me for a long moment, the firelight flickering across the deep lines of his face. I braced myself for a lecture, for suspicion, for the kind of hardened cynicism that had become the Resistance's armor against a galaxy that had given us every reason to expect the worst from anyone wearing Vokhtar skin. Instead, he simply nodded slowly. "Keep it," he said. "Not every one of them is the same. I've seen enough cruelty from our own kind to know that species doesn't decide character, but be careful who you show it to. Not everyone in this cell would understand." He was right about that. Grace, when she learned of it much later, could not hide her discomfort, though she never said anything unkind about it directly. Daniel simply shrugged and said that if it helped me sleep at night, it was no one's business but mine. The rest of the cell never knew, and I preferred it that way. The war did not stay static during those years. What began as scattered pockets of resistance slowly grew into something more organized, more dangerous to the Empire that had once believed humanity broken beyond repair. We were not winning, not in any way that mattered on a galactic scale, but we were bleeding the Vokhtar in ways they had not expected, forcing them to spend resources on garrisons and patrols they would rather have used elsewhere. Rumors began to spread through our ranks, carried by traitors and defectors and the occasional captured transmission, that the Empire's attention was being pulled in other directions, that other conquered worlds were rising, that the vast machine of Vokhtar conquest was groaning under weight it had never expected to carry. And among those rumors, one in particular caught my attention every time I heard it repeated around a campfire or a cracked radio. The old emperor had died. A new ruler had taken the throne, a young queen barely into adulthood by her people's measure, and her reign had already become the subject of confused and uneasy talk throughout the empire. She had reduced tribute demands on several conquered worlds. She had recalled at least 2 garrison commanders known for excessive cruelty. She had, according to one particularly persistent rumor, ordered an investigation into conditions at several refugee camps, an investigation that had resulted in the quiet removal of a handful of officials. I told myself it meant nothing. Empires shifted policy for 1,000 practical reasons that had nothing to do with mercy. I had learned not to hope for kindness from anyone wearing that uniform, no matter how many years had passed since a young noblewoman knelt in the mud in front of a starving child. Hope, in my experience, was a luxury the war did not often allow us to keep. And yet, late at night, turning the pendant over in my fingers, I could not stop myself from wondering if the girl with violet eyes had grown into the woman now sitting on that throne. I did not know it then, but within the year I would find out for certain, and the answer would change the course of everything that came after. The message arrived on a stormy evening, carried by a courier none of us recognized, a thin, nervous man who claimed to represent a coalition of human settlements seeking formal talks with the Vokhtar throne. Owen nearly turned him away at gunpoint before the man managed to explain himself fully, and even then, our entire cell sat in stunned silence around the farmhouse table as he laid out what he was proposing. "The Empire is weaker than it has been in generations," the courier said, spreading a worn map across the table with shaking hands. "Wars on 3 other fronts, rebellions on a dozen worlds. They need this front quiet, and they are willing to negotiate to get it. Reduced tribute, recognized settlements, limited self-governance. It is more than any human world has been offered since the conquest." "And why would they offer any of that?" Grace asked, arms crossed, her voice sharp with the kind of suspicion that had kept her alive this long. "Empires do not negotiate out of kindness." "No," the courier agreed. "They negotiate out of necessity. But the offer is real, and it is coming directly from the throne. The Queen herself has requested a human delegation." The room erupted into argument almost immediately, voices rising over each other, old wounds and older distrust boiling to the surface. Some in our cell wanted nothing to do with any negotiation, convinced it was a trap designed to lure our leadership into the open and destroy what remained of organized resistance in a single stroke. Others, exhausted by years of losing friends and family to a war that showed no sign of ending, argued that we owed it to every settlement still standing to at least hear what was being offered. I said nothing during most of the argument, my hand pressed unconsciously against the pendant hidden beneath my shirt, my mind caught somewhere between the mud of that long-ago camp and the map spread across the table in front of me. Owen finally raised his hand for silence, and the room quieted, reluctantly, the way it always did when he asked. "We will send a delegation," he said. "Small, careful. If it is a trap, we lose few. If it is real, we gain more than we have won in years of fighting. I want volunteers, not conscripts. This is not an order I will give lightly. I volunteered before I had fully decided to." The words left my mouth almost on their own, and by the time I registered what I had said, Owen was already nodding, and Daniel was staring at me from across the table with an expression somewhere between worry and understanding. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Later, after the meeting had broken apart and most of the cell had scattered to their evening tasks. "I know," I said. "Then why volunteer?" I did not have an easy answer for him, not one I could put into words that made sense even to myself. I only knew that something in me needed to see this through, needed to know whether the Empire's new queen was truly capable of the mercy her reign seemed to suggest, or whether it was all simply another cold calculation dressed up in gentler language. I needed, more than anything, to know if the girl with violet eyes had grown into someone worth remembering, or if that single kind moment in the mud had been nothing more than a passing curiosity, forgotten the moment the convoy lifted away. The delegation that formed over the following weeks was small, exactly as Owen had insisted. Claire Bennett, a sharp-minded negotiator who had once studied diplomacy before the war, made such studies useless, led our group with a calm authority that steadied the rest of us. 2 others joined alongside me, representatives from settlements far from our own, chosen for their ability to speak for communities beyond our small resistance cell. We trained for weeks, learning what little we could of Vokhtar customs, court etiquette, the careful dance of formal negotiation that none of us had ever needed to practice before. The journey to the Vokhtar capital took nearly a month, traveling under careful escort through space I had only ever seen from the wrong end of a weapon. I remember pressing my face against the small viewport of our transport as we approached the capital world, staring out at cities that stretched across entire continents, towers of pale stone rising into clouds, lights glittering across the surface of the planet like something out of a story too grand to be real. It was strange, seeing the heart of the empire that had taken everything from me, and finding it beautiful despite every reason I had to hate it. We were housed in a modest wing of the palace complex upon arrival, watched constantly by guards whose faces gave away nothing, fed carefully prepared meals that Claire insisted we eat sparingly of in case they carried anything meant to weaken or confuse us. The days leading up to the formal negotiation crawled by in a haze of tension and careful preparation, each of us rehearsing what we would say, what we would demand, what lines we could not afford to cross. I said little during those preparations. My thoughts kept drifting elsewhere, toward the memory of a small crystal pendant given to a starving child, toward the impossible question of whether I was about to walk into the same room as the woman who had given it to me. The morning of the negotiation arrived cold and clear. Guards led our small delegation through corridors of pale stone, past towering windows that looked out over gardens more beautiful than anything I had seen since Earth's fall, until we reached a set of massive doors carved with images of Vokhtar history, wars and treaties and coronations stretching back further than human civilization had ever recorded. The doors opened, and we walked into the throne room. It was larger than any space I had ever stood in, ceilings stretching so high they seemed to disappear into shadow, columns of dark stone lining a hall filled with nobles and advisors and guards, all of them watching our small human delegation with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. Whispers rippled through the gathered court as we walked forward, and I forced myself not to flinch at the weight of so many hostile eyes. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne carved from the same pale stone as the rest of the palace, sat the queen. I recognized her before Claire had even finished the formal introductions, before the advisors had finished reciting titles and honors, before a single word of negotiation had been spoken. I recognized the shape of her face, the deep violet of her eyes, the way she held herself with a stillness that seemed to be watching everything at once. She had grown, of course, matured into the full authority of her position, her pale armor replaced now with robes of deep blue that marked her as ruler rather than wandering noble. But it was her. I was certain of it, certain in a way that went beyond logic, certain in the way you recognize a voice from a dream you thought you had forgotten. She did not recognize me. Why would she? I had been one face among thousands of suffering children she had encountered on that tour so many years ago, a single small moment in a life that had since carried her through the death of an emperor, the weight of an entire throne, decisions that shaped the fate of countless worlds. I understood that, even as something in my chest ached with the quiet disappointment of being forgotten. Claire began the formal negotiations, her voice steady, despite the obvious tension in the room, laying out the terms our coalition had prepared, requests for recognized human settlements, reduced tribute demands, an end to the punishment raids that had haunted every human world since the conquest. The queen listened with careful attention, occasionally speaking through an advisor to ask clarifying questions, her expression difficult to read beneath the formal mask of court composure. The advisors, however, were far less composed. A tall Voktar noble near the front of the gathered court interrupted Claire more than once, his voice dripping with contempt as he questioned why the throne should extend any consideration whatsoever to what he called vermin who had spent years attacking imperial supply lines and garrison outposts. Other nobles murmured agreement, and I felt the fragile thread of the negotiation beginning to fray with every passing exchange. "These creatures have killed hundreds of loyal soldiers," the noble said, gesturing sharply toward our small delegation. "And now we are asked to reward their violence with recognition and mercy. This is not diplomacy, this is weakness. They killed soldiers who were enforcing a conquest none of them chose," Claire replied, her voice tight but controlled. "Soldiers who burned settlements, who withheld medicine from the sick, who treated an entire species as property rather than people. If that is weakness, then I do not know what strength was meant to look like in this empire." The hall erupted into argument, voices rising from both sides, old grievances spilling out faster than anyone could contain them. I watched the queen's face carefully throughout the growing chaos, and for the first time since we had entered the hall, I saw something crack through her careful composure, a flicker of something that looked almost like exhaustion, as though she had heard this same argument too many times before and had grown weary of watching it repeat. It was in that moment, with the negotiation teetering on the edge of collapse, with generations of anger threatening to drown out any possibility of peace, that I found myself stepping forward without fully deciding to. Claire glanced at me sharply, a silent warning to stay in line, but something in me had already moved past careful diplomacy. I reached beneath the collar of my shirt and drew out the pendant, the same crystal that had hung against my skin through every fight, every loss, every long cold night of the war, and held it up for the entire hall to see. The room fell silent almost instantly, confusion rippling across the faces of nobles and guards alike at the sight of a human delegate holding up what was clearly a piece of Voktar royal craftsmanship. Claire's expression shifted from warning to bewildered curiosity, and beside the throne, I saw the queen's violet eyes fix on the crystal with an intensity that had not been present a moment before. 11 years ago, I said, my voice carrying across the sudden stillness of the hall, I was a child in a refugee camp, with nothing left in the world except a wooden bird my father carved before he died. A young noblewoman visited that camp on a tour I did not understand at the time. She knelt down in the mud in front of me, looked at me like I was a person instead of a number, and asked my name. I paused, my throat tightening around the memory, but I forced myself to continue. I offered her that wooden bird. It was all I had, and something in me wanted to give her the only good thing I owned. She did not take it. Instead, she gave me this pendant, and told me that humans give when they have nothing, and that she would not forget it. The queen had risen slightly from her throne, her hands gripping the armrests, her violet eyes locked on the crystal, still held aloft in my palm. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. I did not know then who she was, I continued. I did not learn her name for years, but I carried that pendant through every battle, every loss. Every night I wondered whether kindness still existed anywhere in this galaxy. And when I heard that the throne had passed to a young queen whose reign was already being spoken of differently than any before it, I began to wonder if the girl who knelt in that mud had grown into the woman now sitting on that throne. I lowered the pendant slowly, my eyes meeting hers across the length of the vast hall. "I think she has," I said quietly. "And I think that single act of kindness, small as it must have seemed to her at the time, is the reason I am standing here today, asking for peace, instead of standing somewhere else, asking for revenge." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake, if I had misjudged everything, if the woman on that throne would simply order us removed for daring to disrupt the formal proceedings with a story from childhood. Claire's hand found my arm, steadying, though whether to comfort me or restrain me, I could not tell. Then the queen rose fully from her throne, descending the wide steps before her advisors could react, crossing the length of the hall with a speed that clearly startled the entire gathered court. She stopped in front of me, close enough now that I could see every detail of her face, could see the way her violet eyes searched mine with something that looked almost like desperate hope. "Ellen," she said softly, the name catching slightly in her throat, exactly the way it had, all those years ago, in the mud of that nameless camp. I felt my own breath catch at the sound of my name in her voice, unchanged despite the years, despite everything that had happened between that moment and this one. "You remember," I whispered. "I have never forgotten," she said. "Not once, in all these years, I have carried the memory of that camp with me, through every decision I have made since taking this throne. I did not know if the child I met that day had survived the war. I did not know if she would ever know what that moment meant to me." Her hand rose slowly, trembling slightly, reaching toward the pendant still held in my palm, and as her fingers brushed against the cool crystal, I watched tears begin to fall from her eyes, silent and unguarded, in front of an entire court that had never once seen their queen weep. No one in that hall moved. I do not think anyone quite knew how to move, faced with the sight of their sovereign standing before a human delegate with tears sliding freely down her face, her hand still resting against the pendant she had given away as a curious young noblewoman more than a decade before. The silence stretched so long that I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the faint hum of the palace itself, somewhere deep beneath the stone floor. It was one of the advisors who finally broke the silence, though not with the contempt I expected. An older woman near the throne, robes marked with symbols I did not recognize, stepped forward slowly and spoke in a voice thick with something I had not expected to hear from any member of that court. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "the hall awaits your word." The queen did not answer immediately. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, an oddly human gesture that seemed to startle her own advisors more than the tears themselves had, and turned slowly to face the gathered nobles who had, only minutes before, been shouting contempt at our small delegation. "You have all heard the story this woman told," she said, her voice steadier now, though still carrying the rough edge of emotion beneath it. "I confirm every word of it. I remember that camp. I remember kneeling in front of a starving child who had nothing, and who still offered me the only thing she owned in the entire world. I have carried that memory through every year of my reign, through every decision that has shaped this empire since I took this throne." She turned back to face me, her violet eyes still bright with unshed tears, and reached out to take my hand gently in both of hers. "I told her, that day, that humans give when they have nothing," she continued, addressing the hall but never breaking her gaze from mine. I did not fully understand what I meant by those words until years later, when I began to study what remained of your species after the conquest. I read reports of human settlements sharing their last rations with strangers. I read of soldiers carrying wounded enemies to safety rather than leaving them to die. I read, again and again, of a species that our empire had tried to break through cruelty, and had instead somehow taught to value kindness more fiercely than we ever had ourselves. The tall noble who had spoken so contemptuously earlier shifted uncomfortably, though he did not dare interrupt again. The rest of the hall remained utterly silent, hanging on every word. "When I took this throne," the queen continued, "I made a promise to myself, quiet and private, that I would not let this empire continue treating your people the way I had witnessed in that camp as a child. I reduced tribute where I could. I recalled commanders whose cruelty had become notorious. I ordered investigations into conditions I found unacceptable. but I could not move faster than the court would allow, and there were many days I feared it would never be enough, that the damage done to your people across generations could never truly be repaired. She glanced down at the pendant, still resting against my palm, her thumb brushing gently across its smooth surface. I did not know, until this very hour, whether the child from that camp had survived the war that followed. I did not know whether she remembered me, or whether that small gift had meant anything at all beyond a passing curiosity, forgotten the moment my convoy lifted away. To stand here now, and learn that she carried it through every battle, every loss, every night of doubt, and that it became the reason she believed peace was still possible between our peoples, is more than I ever dared to hope for. I found my own voice thick with emotion as I answered her, the formal caution Claire had drilled into me during our weeks of preparation falling away entirely. It was more than a passing curiosity, I said. It was the only proof I had, for years, that kindness still existed somewhere in this empire. Every time I wanted to become as cruel as the soldiers who destroyed my settlement, every time the war tried to strip away everything I believed a person should be, I remembered your eyes in that camp, and I remembered that you had chosen to see me instead of ignoring me. It kept something alive in me that the war tried very hard to kill. The Queen's grip on my hand tightened slightly, and she turned once more to address the hall, her voice carrying now with the full authority of her position, steady, despite the tears still marking her face. I will not pretend that a single childhood memory can undo generations of conquest, she said. I will not pretend that the terms this delegation has brought before us are anything less than a serious commitment, one that will require sacrifice from this court, and from the nobles who have grown comfortable with the old ways of ruling conquered worlds. But I have spent my entire reign searching for proof that a different path was possible between our peoples. That proof stands before me now, in the form of a woman who carried a stranger's small kindness through an entire war, and who chose, even after everything this empire took from her, to walk into this hall seeking peace rather than vengeance. She released my hand slowly and turned to face her advisors directly, her posture straightening into something unmistakably regal, the softness of a moment ago folding back beneath the authority she had clearly spent years learning to wear. I am accepting the terms this delegation has proposed, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Recognized settlements, reduced tribute, an immediate end to punishment raids across every conquered human world. Any commander who continues such practices after this proclamation will answer to this throne directly. The tall noble who had spoken against us earlier opened his mouth as though to object, but the Queen's sharp glance silenced him before a single word could escape. The rest of the court, whatever private doubts they carried, offered no further resistance, bowing their heads in the formal gesture of acceptance that Claire had explained to us during our preparation, a gesture I had never expected to see directed, even partially, toward our small human delegation. Claire stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the obvious shock still written across her face, and formally accepted the terms on behalf of the human coalition, her hand extended in the gesture our own preparations had taught us was appropriate for sealing such agreements. The Queen took her hand without hesitation, and the formal negotiation that had begun in tension and contempt ended, improbably, in something that felt almost like the beginning of trust. The rest of that day passed in a blur I struggled to fully absorb. Formal documents were drafted and signed. Advisors on both sides worked through details neither Claire nor I had fully anticipated. Questions of trade routes, communication systems, the slow and complicated work of building something new out of the wreckage of a war that had lasted most of my life. Through all of it, I found myself watching the Queen from across the room, still struggling to reconcile the composed ruler directing her court with the trembling girl who had knelt in the mud so many years before. It was late in the evening, after most of the formal business had concluded and the hall had begun to empty of nobles and advisors, that she found me again, standing near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, the pendant still clutched in my hand. "May I ask you something?" she said quietly, approaching with none of the formal distance that had marked her earlier in the day. "Of course," I said. "The wooden bird," she said. "The one you offered me that day. Do you still have it?" I nodded, reaching into the small pack Claire had allowed me to carry into the palace, and drew out the small carved bird, its edges worn smooth now from years of being held during long nights of doubt and grief. I offered it to her, the same way I had offered it as a child, though this time my hand did not shake with hunger, only with the weight of memory. She took it gently, turning it over in her fingers, her violet eyes tracing the careful lines my father had carved into the wood so many years before he died. "Your father made this," she said softly. "He told me it could fly farther than any ship," I said, "because it flew inside a person's heart instead of the sky." She was quiet for a long moment, holding the small bird carefully in her palm, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I would like to keep this," she said, "if you are willing to part with it, not as a trophy, and not as proof of anything, simply as a reminder, every time I sit upon that throne, of the moment I learned what your people were truly capable of, and the promise I made to myself that day, to become someone worthy of that kindness." I thought of Margaret, of the years I had spent guarding that small wooden bird as though it were the last piece of my father I had left in the world. I thought of every night I had held it alongside the pendant, drawing strength from both in equal measure. And I thought, too, of everything that had happened in that hall only hours before, the tears on a queen's face, the terms that would change the fate of countless human settlements still struggling to survive under Vokhtar rule. "I would like that," I said finally. "I think my father would have liked that too. He always said the bird was meant to fly towards something worth reaching. I cannot think of anywhere better for it to land." She smiled then, small and genuine, the first true smile I had seen cross her face since we had entered that hall, and closed her fingers gently around the small wooden bird. "Then I will give you something in return," she said, "though I suspect you already carry it." I glanced down at the pendant, still resting in my palm, and understood. "A gift for a gift," I said quietly, echoing the words she had spoken to me so long ago in the mud of that nameless camp. "A gift for a gift," she agreed, and for the first time since the war had taken everything from me, I felt something in my chest ease, some old and heavy weight finally beginning to lift, replaced by the fragile, impossible feeling of hope. Peace, I learned quickly, was never as simple as a signature on a formal document. Word of the treaty spread through the empire within days, and while many human settlements greeted the news with cautious relief, not everyone within the Vokhtar court was willing to accept a queen who had chosen to weep in front of humans and grant them mercy their conquerors never expected to offer. I stayed on at the palace for several weeks after the signing, working alongside Claire and a small team of advisors to help establish the early framework of the agreement, communication channels between human settlements and imperial administrators, safe passage routes for supplies, the slow, careful work of dismantling years of suspicion on both sides. It was during those weeks that I came to understand just how fragile the peace we had won truly was, and how many powerful voices within the empire were working quietly against it. The tall noble from the throne room, whose name I eventually learned was Kalen Voth, had not simply accepted defeat, the way his silence in that hall suggested. He belonged to a faction of hardline nobles who believed the queen's mercy toward humanity was not compassion but weakness, a dangerous precedent that threatened the empire's authority over every conquered world still under its control. I did not learn the true extent of his opposition until the night everything nearly fell apart. It began with Daniel's voice in my earpiece, urgent and afraid in a way I had rarely heard from him even during our most desperate fights back home. "Ellen, we have a problem," he said, his words rushed and clipped. "Owen intercepted a transmission an hour ago. There's a strike planned against the palace tonight, not from us, from inside." I was standing in the quiet garden outside my quarters when the message came through, the cool night air suddenly feeling sharp and dangerous around me. "Say that again," I said. "A faction within the Vokhtar military," Daniel said. "They're planning to move against the Queen tonight, during the formal reception for the treaty. They think removing her will end the peace before it has a chance to take hold. Owen thinks it's Voth's people. We don't have proof yet, but we don't have time to wait for proof either." My mind raced through the implications even as I began moving swiftly back toward the palace's main halls. The reception Daniel mentioned was already underway, a gathering of nobles and advisors and a handful of human representatives meant to formally celebrate the treaty before word of it spread fully across both human and Vokhtar worlds. If the Queen was truly in danger, she was in danger tonight, surrounded by exactly the sort of controlled, crowded environment that made an attack both easier to execute and harder to stop. "How much time do we have?" I asked. "Owen doesn't know. Could be minutes, could be hours. We're moving toward the palace now, but we're outside the security perimeter. You're the only one of us actually inside." I did not slow down as I processed that information, my feet already carrying me faster through the garden paths toward the sound of distant music drifting from the reception hall. Whatever protection the palace guards provided, I no longer trusted it completely, not after learning that the threat might be coming from within the very structure meant to guard the throne. I reached the edge of the reception hall within minutes, slipping past guards who recognized me now as part of the human delegation and waved me through without question. The hall itself glittered with soft light and quiet conversation, nobles in fine robes mingling near tables of food I did not trust myself to eat. The Queen, standing near the center of the room in deep blue formal wear, speaking calmly with a cluster of advisors as though the day's tension had fully passed. I scanned the crowd carefully, my instincts sharpened by years of combat, refusing to relax despite the peaceful surface of the gathering. It was Grace, of all people, who had trained me most thoroughly in reading a room for danger, teaching me to notice the small details that revealed a threat before it fully announced itself. A guard standing too still, a conversation carrying too much tension beneath its polite surface, eyes that lingered too long in one particular direction. I found what I was looking for near one of the side entrances, a cluster of guards wearing uniforms that matched the palace security, but moved with a stiffness that did not match the relaxed posture of the rest of the room. One of them caught my eye briefly and looked away too quickly, and something cold settled into my stomach. I did not have time to alert anyone through proper channels. I moved instead, cutting quickly through the crowd toward the Queen, ignoring the startled looks of nobles I brushed past along the way. "Your Majesty," I said, keeping my voice low but urgent as I reached her side, "we need to move, now." She turned to me with a flicker of confusion, but whatever she saw in my expression convinced her faster than any explanation could have. "What is happening?" she said quietly, already stepping subtly away from the advisors surrounding her. "I don't know exactly," I admitted, "but there's a threat inside this room. My people intercepted a transmission about a strike against you tonight. I think it's already begun." Her eyes hardened instantly, years of careful composure replaced by the sharp focus of someone who had clearly trained for exactly this kind of danger, even if she had never truly expected to face it during her own reign. "The side entrance," she said quietly, nodding almost imperceptibly toward the guards I had noticed moments before. "Those are not my personal guard. I do not recognize them." Before either of us could move further, the lights throughout the hall flickered once, sharply, and the doors at the main entrance sealed shut with a heavy mechanical sound that sent a wave of alarmed murmurs rippling through the gathered crowd. The guards near the side entrance moved in unison then, weapons rising, and I understood in that instant that whatever plan Voth's faction had set in motion, it had just begun. "Down," I shouted, grabbing the Queen's arm and pulling her behind an overturned table as the first shots tore through the hall, scattering panicked nobles in every direction. The chaos that followed happened almost too quickly to fully process. Years of combat instinct took over as I positioned myself between the Queen and the advancing guards, my mind cataloging exits, cover, weapons within reach, the same calculations I had made 100 times before in 100 desperate fights back on human worlds I had fought to protect. The Queen, to her credit, did not freeze the way I half expected a life of palace comfort to have left her. She moved with me, ducking behind cover, her eyes sharp and alert, despite the danger closing in around us. "There's a passage behind the eastern column," she said quickly, pointing toward a section of the hall, partially obscured by fleeing guests. "It leads to the palace's inner corridors. If we can reach it." A shot tore through the table we were crouched behind, sending splinters scattering across the floor, and I pulled her lower, my heart pounding as I tried to track the position of the attackers through the chaos of the crowd. "On my signal," I said. "We move fast, and we don't stop until we're through that passage. Can you run in that?" She glanced down briefly at her formal robes, and without hesitation, tore a long section of fabric away from the hem, freeing her legs enough to move quickly. "Now I can," she said. We broke from cover together, weaving through overturned tables and scattering guests, the Queen's own palace guard finally beginning to respond to the chaos, engaging the attackers near the sealed main doors while we made for the eastern passage she had identified. I felt a shot pass close enough to my shoulder to tear through the fabric of my sleeve, and forced myself not to slow down, pulling the Queen along beside me until we reached the narrow passage hidden behind the column. The corridor beyond was dim and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos we had just escaped, and for a moment we simply stood there, breathing hard, listening to the muffled sounds of continued fighting echoing through the walls behind us. "They will try to follow," the Queen said, still catching her breath. "This passage leads toward the throne room. There are additional guards stationed there, loyal to me directly, rather than to the general palace security. If we can reach them." A sound from further down the corridor cut her words short, footsteps approaching fast, and I pulled her behind a support pillar just as two of the disguised guards rounded the corner, weapons raised, clearly having anticipated exactly the escape route we had chosen. I did not hesitate. Years of fighting had stripped away any illusion that hesitation kept anyone safe, and I moved before conscious thought could slow me down, disarming the nearest attacker with a speed that startled even me, years of desperate training finally proving its worth in the one moment that mattered most. The Queen, to my genuine surprise, moved just as quickly against the second attacker, revealing a combat training I had not expected from someone raised within the comfort of the palace, striking with a precision that spoke of lessons learned long before tonight. When both attackers lay disarmed and subdued on the corridor floor, we stood facing each other for a brief moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline of the fight still coursing through both of us. "You fight," I said, unable to fully hide my surprise. "I have spent my entire reign surrounded by nobles who believe my mercy makes me weak," she said, straightening slightly despite her torn robes. "I learned long ago that I could not afford to actually be weak, no matter how gentle they believed my heart to be." We continued through the passage together, reaching the additional guards she had mentioned within minutes, loyal soldiers who moved quickly to secure the corridor and send word back toward the reception hall, where Owen and the rest of our people, alongside the palace's own security forces, were already working to subdue the remaining attackers. By the time the chaos fully settled, several hours later, Voth and a dozen of his co-conspirators had been captured, their plan to destroy the treaty and remove the Queen from power exposed and shattered in a single desperate night. I sat afterward in a quiet side chamber, my hands finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed, the way they always did once a fight was truly over. The Queen joined me there sometime later, her formal robes replaced now with simpler clothing, a small bandage wrapped around one arm where a stray shot had grazed her during the chaos. "You saved my life tonight," she said quietly, settling into the seat across from me. "You saved your own life. Plenty of times over," I said. "I just happened to be standing nearby when it mattered." She smiled faintly at that, though the exhaustion of the night was clearly written across her face. Voth and his faction will not be the last to resist this peace, she said. There will be others, on both sides, who believe cruelty is safer than trust. I cannot promise you that the road ahead will be easy. I didn't expect it to be, I said. Nothing worth building ever is. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that. Two people from worlds that had spent years trying to destroy each other, now bound together by a memory neither of us had ever fully let go of. Eventually, she reached into a small pouch at her side and drew out the wooden bird, turning it gently in her fingers before looking up to meet my eyes. I meant what I said, that day in the hall, she said. This will remind me, every time I sit upon that throne, of what your people are capable of, even after everything mine took from you. I intend to spend the rest of my reign proving myself worthy of that kindness. I reached beneath my collar and drew out the pendant one final time, holding it up so it caught the soft light of the chamber, the same way it had caught the weak morning light of that nameless camp so many years before. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure my people remember that peace, once found, is worth protecting, I said. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Old wounds did not heal overnight, and the work of rebuilding trust between two peoples who had spent generations at war required patience neither species had ever been particularly skilled at offering. But slowly, settlement by settlement, treaty by treaty, the peace that began in that throne room held, strengthened rather than broken by the attack that had tried to destroy it in its earliest hours. I returned eventually to the human worlds I had fought so hard to protect, carrying word of the treaty and the promise it represented, and I watched over the following years as settlements once starved and desperate slowly began to rebuild, aided by resources the Empire had never before been willing to share. I stayed in contact with the Queen throughout those years, our correspondence growing from careful formality into something that eventually resembled genuine friendship. Two women bound together by a single act of kindness, exchanged in the mud of a camp neither of us had ever expected to matter. Historians on both sides, in the decades that followed, would come to call that meeting in the throne room the true beginning of lasting peace between our species. The moment a queen's tears in front of her own court proved that mercy was not weakness after all, but the foundation upon which something far stronger could eventually be built. I have heard the story retold many times since, in songs and records and the careful language of official history, and I have noticed that most versions focus on the treaty itself, the terms and conditions that reshaped the balance between human and Vaktar worlds. But I remember it differently. I remember a small wooden bird, carved by a father who did not live to see what it would one day accomplish. I remember a crystal pendant, pressed into a child's hand by a stranger who chose, against every expectation of her position, to see a starving girl as a person rather than a number. I remember that peace, in the end, did not begin with armies or treaties or the careful calculations of desperate rulers. It began with a single act of giving, offered by someone who had nothing left to give, and returned by someone who had everything to lose, by kneeling down in the mud to notice her at all. The bird still sits, to this day, in a place of honor within the palace, a quiet reminder to every ruler who follows of what true strength can look like. And the pendant still hangs around my neck, worn smooth now by decades of memory, proof that even in the darkest corners of a galaxy shaped by conquest and cruelty, kindness given freely can still find its way home.